Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. When I heard that Austin McCoy had written a book about De La Soul, I couldn't wait to read it. I also knew that I wanted to try to get Hanif Abdurraqib on to join Austin and I in conversation. We recorded this back on October 22nd, but I held on to it to line it up with the release of Austin's book, Living in a Daisy Age, which came out this past week. Because we recorded it last October, we don't talk about De La Soul's most recent album, Cabin in the Sky, which I'm sure we all would have had a lot to say about. We do talk about all their other albums in relation to our own lives, politics, and more. So this is a two-part conversation. There's a second part with just Austin and myself where we get into some more questions about the book itself, as well as the methodology that McCoy used in putting it together. We'll release that part two conversation on Thursday. For this version, just to briefly introduce our guests, Hanif Abdurraqib is a poet, essayist, and cultural critic from Columbus, Ohio. His best-selling and award-winning books include Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes to a Tribe Called Quest, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, A Little Devil in America, in praise of Black performance, and There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension, as well as a couple of poetry collections, A Fortune for Your Disaster and The Crown Ain't Worth Much. We've previously hosted Hanif for multiple conversations about his work, including a dialogue between him and Fred Moten. Austin McCoy is an assistant professor of history at West Virginia University, specializing in African American history, labor history, social movements, and hip hop culture. Dr. McCoy's research interests focus on African American history and the U.S. left, labor and political economy, and social movements and activism. In addition to this book, he has a current manuscript project tentatively titled The Quest for Democracy, Black Power, New Left, and Progressive Politics in the Post-Industrial Midwest. It revises conventional explanations emphasizing the separation and decline of Black power and the New Left in the U.S. during the 1970s and 1980s. We previously discussed Austin's piece, Disorganize the State, the Black Workers' Congress Visions of Abolition Democracy in the U.S. If you like what we do, please remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share this conversation with others you think might enjoy it, and support us on Patreon at patreon.com/millennialsAreKillingCapitalism. Our work is solely funded by people like you who watch and listen to it and engage with us. I also just want to say that this conversation was what kind of generated the idea for everything else with Jay. So we will post this conversation also over on that YouTube channel. I encourage folks to subscribe to that. We haven't done a lot in the last month or so, but we do plan to have more episodes coming out there this year. So now here's our first conversation with Austin McCoy and Hanif Abdurraqib on Living in a Daisy Age, the music, culture, and world De La Soul made. So we're here to talk about Living in a Daisy Age, which is Austin McCoy's forthcoming book on De La Soul. When I saw this book was coming out, I remember seeing Austin, who's been on here previously. We did a discussion about, Detroit and Black Radical Workers Congress, right? And or the Black Workers Congress, and also a little bit about like Drum and League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And so, I've known you for a while from kind of a political history lens. And I remember seeing when you announced that you were going to be doing a De La Soul book, and I thought, oh, that's great. That's what a great person to write this book. And I reached out to the person I knew that I would love to have the three of us in conversation, which was Hanif Abdurraqib, who of course wrote an amazing book about Tribe Called
Yeah.
Quest a few years ago. So I thought it would be fun to talk about De La Soul, to talk a little bit about, revisit some of that native tongues history, the De La Soul history, and talk also about how these albums kind of connected with us all personally, and what De La means and meant to us, and some of the politics or ethics or things like that also that we might find in the music that draw us to it in a specific way. So let's start with kind of a question just related to that of your recollection around um kind of what the group represented for you. And obviously, this could shift a little bit over time, but where they sat in your own youth in particular, and your relationship to hip hop, and also just our relationship to, like, who we are, I guess, to some extent, and kind of the world we grew up in. So, Hanif, let's start with you.
Yeah, I was fortunate growing up as a music fan because I'm the youngest of four, so I had older siblings, and in some cases, much older siblings. My oldest brother and oldest sister are like 8 to 10 years older than me, and everyone had different music tastes. But De La Soul was a thread that kind of ran through everyone's interest, and I loved De La Soul is Dead, which is the first record I heard of theirs, and I loved it mostly because of the way skits were deployed on the record to kind of tie a narrative thread together. And so it felt like you were genuinely, and this was a time where, rap albums were just really overly inundated with skits, I would say, with varied degrees of success. I think sometimes it's like, what's going on here, but De La Soul is Dead. The skits were so interesting, and they all had a thread running through them. So the kid finds
Right.
a record, throws the record out, um, and so more than their songs, I remember the album cover and I remember the skits. And this was at a time where in my house, we sometimes had cable, sometimes didn't. And so TV raps could sometimes be on, but sometimes not. And there was a stretch around the time De La Soul is Dead came out where we did not have cable. So I didn't know what they looked like until maybe a year after or 2 years after I saw some music video. That wasn't even theirs, I think. I think it was maybe a Tribe video or something they popped up in. And that was cool to me too. I got to build a mythology around this group without bearing witness to them, which is something that I think is just so borderline impossible now.
Mm-hmm. What's going to be great about this conversation is I think we're all sort of coming, at De La Soul in a similar way where, the first, like I was saying earlier, the first album that I heard when it came out was Stakes is High, but my first introduction to De La Soul was the Me, Myself, and I video, right? I mean, so, late 80s, like I'm 8 years old, and, we all spent we spent time around the TV, and I remember just seeing the video and just wondering, like, who are these guys, right? Like, who are these guys who, like, they look very different. They don't, they're not Run DMC. They're not LL Cool J. They, look like goofballs. But the hook of the song, the chorus of the song was just, to me, so catchy and something that I just, could easily remember because it's so simple. And the beat was, the knee deep, reuse was, also very catchy. And yeah, like it was a colorful video. Like, so like the aesthetics, the hook, the lyrics, I really didn't understand what was, going on because I was 8 years old, but like all that appealed to me. And then I think, yeah, there is just this gap, in my listening with De La Soul, to where, I remember seeing Ego Trippin', but it didn't necessarily appeal to me because I didn't understand it. I didn't understand that song until much later. And then, yeah, it was Stakes is High, and again, first encountering it on BET, Rap City, and just wondering, what is this, right? Like, I know these guys, right? Like, I knew who De La Soul was, but since it had been such a long time that it was just like, oh, wow, they're back. That was my thinking, right? I mean, it seemed like they had not released an album, for like 8 or 9 years, even though they had before. And from there, it was like, oh my God, Posdnuos is, just, incredible lyricism on the track. And, I love the video, them just being regular people, more or less, with the exception of Posdnuos playing, Jerry Stackhouse one-on-one, right? I mean, that was sort of the only piece of that video that was sort of surreal, where you're like, okay, that's pretty cool. But other than that, it was just like, wow, this isn't like, they're not trying to be like superheroes like Wu-Tang, or they weren't, Tupac and Biggie, right? They're trying to be regular people. And, at 15, 16 years old, I felt like that's what I wanted to be, right? Like, it's like I was tired of trying to act like something I wasn't, because I'm not a hard person by any stretch of the imagination. So, me, myself, and I, and then like, you have to fast forward to Stakes is High, and sort of, them beginning to sort of lean a lot more into the regular guy rap.
I think my journey on it was quite similar to yours, Austin. And I think I actually had 3 Feet High and Rising as the first album of theirs I bought, but it was not when it came out, right? So it was like, as I started to get into hip hop, and you talk about this stuff in the book too, like reading the Source magazine and all of this stuff, and you kind of, I mean, this is the thing you referenced as well, Hanif, like not having, like I didn't have MTV or BET a lot of my youth, like certain points I did. And also my parents didn't love the idea of me watching that also. So it was like, it had to kind of be snuck, or like, the point at which I could finally watch stuff in my own room, which was later on, and that kind of stuff. But I remember when it was sort of embedded through the Source and other things that like their early work was really classic and also influential of other artists that I liked later on, right? And so I think probably all of us went through these phases as well in the time period. And you really talk about it in the book, Austin, too, of like when you get really engaged in rap and you're about our age, we're all from like the 80s, early to mid, right? In terms of when we were born. And then you're like, oh, I need to go back, right? And kind of study this. There's all this stuff that's referenced, or lyrics or beats or whatever. And, I had a friend who used to call it doing your nerd rap or rap nerd due diligence, basically. And so it was like, and so 3 Feet High and Rising I got. And it was definitely one of those albums that just blew my mind because it was so different. And I'm listening to it as like a young teenager. And it's a very teenage album. Like, I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about De La Soul as a group that I know we will talk about, is that they're one of the few rap groups I can think of where, they age with their work, and each album feels very honest to where they are at the time, and I know there's like some stuff Prince Paul has talked about and things like that about the early work, and maybe some of it's a little bit more his influence and they went along with it and that kind of thing. Just in terms of some of the decisions around skits and beats and things like that. But I think that they're who they are artistically, and kind of whether it's their humor or their critique or their like most honest reflections on their albums, it always felt to me very true to kind of who they were and who they wanted to be right in that time period. And there's something I think really just kind of magnetic about them as a group because of that, because in the music industry more broadly, I think there's just so much encouragement of artists to kind of present themselves in a certain way, whatever that is at the time. And I feel like they always have kind of rejected that and gone their own way.
Yeah, there is an impulse to, especially I think around hip hop, to self-mythologize. Even if we're thinking of it, and I say this as someone who was a fan of self-mythologizing. I mean, like, gosh, I was like a teenager when the lore of 50 Cent kind of arrived before he did. And I found that so fast. The DMX, I remember DMX, the lore of DMX arriving to me before I even knew what he looked like. That was so alluring. That was so appealing to me. But I do love that the real foundational thing about Native Tongues is kind of like Austin was talking about. They're just kind of a normal crew, whereas Wu-Tang did have all this beautiful kind of mythology woven into their entire being. Native Tongues, it was kind of like, we're just the normal folks. And I will say, so I'm glad you mentioned Stakes Is High. Austin, I was rereading your book, as I mentioned earlier, and I really loved thinking through 1996 in specific. Stakes Is High is the first rap album. Well, I think it is the first rap album that I purchased with my own money. And I remember this because, so for me, 1996 is the greatest year in rap album, for the form of the rap album. And there's a specific stretch between like May and the end of July where, I mean, it's just like May 28th, you got Shaheem's Lost Generation, which I think is an incredibly underrated, brilliant record. June 4th, you got Legal Drug Money from Lost Boys. That next week, you get Reasonable Doubt and the Prince Paul record that I actually like. I think a lot of people slept on it. The week after that, you get Stakes Is High. July 2nd, you get Stakes Is High, and It Was Written on the same day. And the first Crucial Conflict record, which I don't think is a classic, but I do think it's good and it's interesting. And then later in July, you get that Tribe record, Beats, Rhymes, and Life, and UGK's Riding Dirty. So this was, while 1996 is an especially stunning and stellar year for the rap albums of form, particularly that run of records in the summer of 96 was just, I don't think we've ever seen anything like it since. And I remember, I didn't grow up with a lot of money. So it's like I had enough money for one album, like a month, not even a week, a month. And I remember being in the store and trying to pick between Stakes Is High and It Was Written, and walking out with Stakes Is High because of how much I love the singles.
Yeah, I mean, 1996, and when I teach my hip hop history classes with students, like this is sort of where I am like, okay, you really do not understand what was happening in the 1990s, right? In terms of the types of releases that were dropping, right? I mean, earlier that year, you get the Fugees, you get Tupac, Tupac, also drops Hit 'Em Up, right? I mean, like, so 1996 was a wild year. After Beats, Rhymes, and Life, we get Hell on Earth and we get Muddy Waters. We also get Iron Man, right? I mean, so like there's just so much amazing music that's coming out in 1996. And similarly, I remember I bought It Was Written first, and part of it was because I remember being at a basketball court because I grew up in Mansfield, Ohio. And I remember being at one of the courts and overhearing someone blaring the message and was just like, what the hell is that?
Yeah, that was a real, yeah.
Yeah. And
they were playing that all the time on the streets.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was like, I got to go get that. And then it was like, wait a minute, Stakes Is High is also out. And then I think, a couple weeks later, I grabbed that CD too. And yeah, like, we had a budget and it was like, okay, so how many of us are going to get what album? Right. I mean, which I think is something that, I miss about the 90s, which, all of this was very collective, because we all didn't have the money that we might have as adults. And, so yeah, if I got It Was Written, someone needs to go buy that Lost Boys, or someone needs to go buy the Stakes Is High or the Beats, Rhymes, and Life. And I think, we had to sort of pull our resources together in order to, listen to all this music. But yeah, I mean, 1996, I mean, it's a great year to sort of start buying CDs. I mean, I started buying CDs in 93, 94, I think. Ice Cube's The Predator was like the first one I bought. And yeah, it was the one that I was able to like, hey mom, can I buy this? And then, at some point, she overhears what he's saying and she's like, what the hell is this? I mean, so, but yeah, like I couldn't imagine sort of if my first real experience as a consumer of rap being, either 95, 96 or 98.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I kind of want to jump to a question around sampling a little bit, because I think that this is like a really important aspect of De La Soul's legacy, also hip hop just in general. And I mean, it's an interesting topic because it's wrapped up in issues that I know we all care about, right? Which is like, artists being screwed over by the music industry in, one generation or another, and then trying to figure out ways that they can continue to support themselves off of their music, but also then from the people who are sampling, it's like being able to work with what resources you have to make music for yourself to put work out. And then as listeners, right, there's just so much cool stuff that's happening in especially the early 90s and the mid 90s, really throughout the 90s. But, sampling is such an art form in that period. And De La Soul and Prince Paul obviously have like a very innovative role in that, a very specific role in that, in terms of, this kind of collage of samples, right? The way, not just like an individual loop and you throw drums on it, or, working with just the same break beats, or, a lot of the different things that might have been more popular before them or afterwards. But also it runs into issues right away because they're also sampling so kind of promiscuously, I guess you would say, right? That like they're there's a lot of artists who can come to them for legal suits and things like this. And this is actually part of why, what you talk about, Austin, like settling that becomes part of why we don't get De La Soul's music on streaming services for a very long time. And that, and obviously issues between them and Tommy Boy, which was always a part of their their history as well. But what do we want to say about this? Because I think it's a really important thing, and I think it's tricky to wade through because you're also just dealing with kind of the confines of capitalism and intellectual property, and a lot of these systems that we might not really believe in terms of like, this is the way things should go. But on the other side of that, obviously, is people's livelihoods and then questions of artistic creativity and all of that. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think I just keep on coming back to, there's, I can't remember the exact, interview, that De La Soul was sort of giving, but, at some point, Dave Jolicoeur, plug to True Goy to Dove, right? I mean, he just comes out and says that, the point, and I'm like, this is a rough paraphrase, but, we should basically be able to do whatever we want creatively, right? I mean, like, so De La Soul has always sort of embodied this, ethic of artistic freedom and creative freedom. And I, call it, a creative individualism in the sense of, they believe that everyone should try the best to be themselves, right? But also, folks should have full reign over, sort of being able to pull together as many different sources as possible in order to, create art, and I think, on one hand, this is sort of, where some of their politics, their sort of, cultural politics comes into play, right? This idea that, yeah, like, all, obviously, artists might be recording music and, yeah, they should have some ownership over it. But at the same time, there should be an ethic of shared ownership as well. And this shared ownership is what, drives innovation. And obviously it drove innovation in hip hop, right? I mean, 3 Feet High and Rising, Paul's Boutique, and, It Takes a Nation of Millions, right? I mean, like, these are the sort of triumvirate of the, collage sampling albums, even though there would be more, more that would come after. But as we get to the late 90s, sampling becomes equated with, Sean Combs's, approach of just conspicuous, sampling or beat jacking, however we might want to sort of describe it. Right. I mean, so like there is something, at least in, the mainstream of rap, that is lost. I think by the time you get to 1998, 1999, even though we still have folks like DJ Premier, Pete Rock, De La Soul, but like even De La Soul's sampling becomes a little more stripped down. I mean, Stakes is High, like there are samples on it, but it's not nearly as many. And because of the sort of rise of the sort of economy around policing sampling, like they had to have conversations with Tommy Boy about, okay, like what is the state of artists of other artists' discographies and sort of who owns what, and if there's too many sort of owners or owners who might want to become litigious, then we might need to stay away from that. And you can sort of tell that that was not the concern, right, in 1988 or 1999.
Yeah, the form of a couple things that interest me. I mean, I love the era of the collage sample. I love the Bomb Squad, where you would look at Nation of Millions, and some of those songs have like 17 samples on them. This was important to me because it operated as a portal for knowledge in a way. Again, I'm youngest four, so my siblings had tapes and CDs, cassette tapes usually, and I loved looking at liner notes, because liner notes, they can be informational in terms of lineage building. And so I would read the liner notes when I was in the early 90s. I'd read liner notes, especially after I got familiar with De La. I went back and listened to 3 Feet High and Rising. And then I would go down to my parents' record collections and try to find the samples. And so like on Buddy, which has that Commodore sample, and it has that invitation sample written on the wall. Like, I'll try to find these things and then match them up in my head, right? There's a way that I think sampling, for all of its flaws and for all of the policing that got built into it, which is really, while yes, I think these two things are at odds in terms of my belief system, in a sense where I do believe in artistic work being honored, I also struggle with just the concept of policing creative work in that manner, and the ways that it is policed, kind of using the same court system that is corrupt and flawed in all these ways. However, I also really loved sampling as a portal, as a tool for knowledge for me when I was a kid. I was so curious about how things were made, and it was so invigorating for me. I feel like people you don't really get the rush of this now in the same way, because you could just type in something into a streaming platform, but there was something so cool about saying, okay, I'm gonna write down this song that's in these liner notes, and I'm gonna just go see if my parents have the record, and then I'll put that record on and put the needle down and match these sounds up. That was really life-changing for me. And I do think, to think about what happened in the late 90s, some of that was just due to saying, well, we can't collage sample like we used to, so let's just sample one thing and map it onto this song. But some of that was also tied into capitalism. It was tied into making as many hits as possible, right? This is why Sean Combs formed the Hitmen, which, the Hitmen, there were talented producers in that cohort but so much of that process was trying to mirror, and Jermaine Dupri had some of this approach to mirroring the Berry Gordy thing of, let's create an assembly line and just get the records out and get the records out and get the records out. And I'm not saying that created an ecosystem of carelessness, but I do think it was not as, sampling was not treated with care. I think about someone now today who I love, a producer I love, is Conductor Williams, right? And so much of what I love about him is that you can tell he really cares about sampling. I mean, he really cares about, he likens it to this kind of spiritual experience, or this kind of resurrection, or this summoning. And that shows in his work. There's such a depth of care in not only what he samples, but how he samples it. And I think, he is from an era. He's from a very specific era, the era that we are from, where he too perhaps was a kid searching for records and finding gold in them too.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting. I also, the same thing there. I mean, it was a portal, and it drove me to all kinds of other music. But also I was thinking about, as you were talking about that, the first time that I sat and listened to Follow the Leader by Rakim, and it just like, blew my mind, the whole album, I mean. But part of what it was like what he was doing and the way he was rapping and everything. But another part of it was that because I listened to it in like the mid 90s, right? There were all of these examples where you would hear him say something and you'd think, oh, like that's the line that Nas is saying here, or Biggie, or Jay-Z. Like, so there was like this, it was real, it was kind of a similar thing to sampling in some respect of, these artists, showing respect, Prodigy from Mobb Deep, like by just incorporating like half a bar, right, from somebody else and putting it in there. Which obviously in some ways connects to ego tripping also. Maybe we could go there next. Why don't we go to, what for each of you is the De La Soul album that is your favorite, and has this shifted over time? Like, if it was different at some point, why was it different at a different point in your life?
Yeah. I mean, I think to sort of, punctuate, what y'all were saying about sort of sampling and it, yeah, these artists, obviously like hip hop, rap, jazz, R&B, right? I mean, like all these artists are having a conversation, right? When they're referencing each other and, yeah, they're building up a library, and it's something that, yeah, when I teach, I try to, get across to my students is, fans and these artists, they're like archivists, librarians, they are sort of keepers of knowledge. And, that's the sort of undercurrent that, when you are sort of going on to Spotify or Tidal or Apple Music, you should sort of keep in mind, right? I mean, that was the point of, having physical copies. So then you could sort of open up the liner notes. So, no, I think, incredibly important. But in terms of my favorite album, I think it's just always been De La Soul is Dead. I mean, I think that's just sort of how it's been with me. And, I listened to it for the first time, I think it was either 1997 or 1998. I believe it was probably 1998 because that's when the Source put out its 100th issue. And, I bought it, and it just sort of became our encyclopedia of hip hop, and we try to get as many of the albums as we possibly could. And I remember, there's a section where, the Source discusses or lists their 5 mic albums, and it was like, oh, De La Soul is Dead is one of them. And I had to check this out. And I think, the first time listening to it, it was the album out of, all of them, that just sort of grabbed me and just never let go. Right. I mean, like there's so many songs, as, Hanif is, mentioned the skits, all made sense. And there were skits on top of skits. And it was sort of their way of experimenting with other genres of music, whether it was like punk rock or house music. But then, yeah, just there's so many of my favorite De La Soul songs are just on that album, whether it's Oodles of O's, a rolling jam, a roller skating jam named Saturdays, Let Me In, Pass the Plugs is one of my favorite, De La Soul songs. Of course, then we got, Millie pulled a pistol on Santa, right? I mean, and, that being an incredibly serious song, I understood the gravity of it to a degree at 17 years old, but then the older I got, the more I sort of appreciated it. And then, yeah, even, Ring, 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 which is like one of the first songs I listened to after I learned about Plug 2's passing. Like that was the first song I went to, and De La Soul is Dead was the first album I went to after hearing that he passed. So yeah, it really, that album, it's one of those albums for me where, you get the cliche question of you have, 5 albums you can have on a sort of remote island or, or in a desert, what are you going to choose? And De La Soul is usually near the top. De La Soul is Dead, I mean.
I mean, you can't go wrong to me. I tend to keep, if I had to pick one to live with, it would be Stakes is High. But De La Soul is Dead is also like those are 2 5 mic albums to me. I know one is literally a 5 mic album, and I think Stakes got 4.5 mics. But so those are my favorites. I do also though want to say, because I don't think it gets talked about a lot, and I find it very intriguing. I think In the Anonymous Nobody is a really special record for a couple reasons. One, it's so wide ranging and ambitious that it is almost like the culmination of all their kind of far flung ideas in the years past. And because it's so wide ranging and ambitious, it is it's imperfect. I don't think it's bad. I think it's actually very, very, very good. But, it's imperfect in part because it is so wide ranging. Like Damon Albarn's on it, David Byrne's on it. There's that Houdini song with the 2 Chainz verse that I love. Like I love the 2 Chainz verse on that song. That was in a moment where I think 2 Chainz was rapping very well. And to have him pop up on that Daylight record and really, deliver a verse with care and thoughtfulness. I think there's that line like, I'm wearing a gold watch that obviously don't work. I love that line. And that's one of those albums that comes in the later career of an artist or group that I think is easy to overlook because it is easy to think that their best work is beyond them. But And the Anonymous Nobody is an album where you can tell they're still pushing themselves from an idea standpoint, and they're still pushing themselves from an ambition standpoint. And I think like 80% of it is executed very well. And I can absolutely forgive the 20% that isn't because of how good the 80% is. And because it would be significantly easier for them to just kind of run it back and do the comfortable thing. Which, I think we see that in rap music that has not great results. Slick Rick put out a record this year that I loved. Like, I think it was an incredible album because of this same thing where he is still Slick Rick. He's still doing what he does, but he has evolved as an MC, and you can hear it at like 50 something years old, So I really do have a soft spot and a big heart for the later career rap album by the established legend. And I think it fails when you try to retread. And I mean, I know we all love Wu-Tang. We all love Ghostface, but like, I was listening to Supreme Clientele too, and I was like, oh man, this is maybe just you trying to relive the glory days. But we have that already, like we have the glory days. And I love Ghostface, like literally, I mean, truly like one of my favorite rappers of all time. And I'm not trying to, shit on bro. But I think when I think about In the Anonymous Nobody, it's really an album that is not a group resting on its laurels and trying to push forward what they've already done. They're trying to go beyond the beyond they've already built.
Yeah, no, like it's a great sort of observation. I mean, because songs like Drawn, right, where it's like, Paz is rapping about, trying to reckon with his infidelities and his limitations, and the beat is just sort of subtly building, and then you really only get the beat for the last 30 seconds, right? And it's just like you feel like kind of robbed because I wanted to hear more of the beat, as it built, but then it's just something that artists don't do, right? And it would be something that if you were sort of working, with a producer in the 90s or the 2000s, they would be like, no, you got to have the whole beat, like, what are we doing here? Right. I mean, so yeah, that was like, it's one of the songs that, I love it. And it is also kind of vexing to me because I'm just like, it's like some of the Pete Rock instrumental interludes where you're like, oh my God, why isn't anyone rapping over this? Right. So like, but no, I think that is a great sort of example. And I think that does sort of capture what De La Soul is that they always care about their artistic output. Right. And they care in a way that, it doesn't mean that Ghostface or other artists don't care, but De La Soul is always trying to find something different to do, which is, just with this, like, sample a live band, right?
Right. Yeah, it is just, yeah, you're right. I don't know. And for me, like, I think, I don't even know if it's care versus don't care. It's just hard. It's hard when you've done great things to not want to just return to the formula of that greatness and say, let's just give it, and I imagine too, there's pressure to return to that. There's pressure to say, you have this iconic, masterful early mid-career, and now you're in your later career, and you have to remind people what made you great. So just do the thing that you did that was great. But things actively and actually change, and I, Jared, you made this great point about how De La's never been afraid to grow and grow up and grow along. And I think that is the mark of great rap groups to me. Like, I love Little Brother, for example, and I love Little Brother because they're just, very, they've always kind of felt very grown. Like, the Minstrel Show is this kind of sneering and funny, but also heartbreaking critique of the landscape they're operating in. And ever since that project, they've become so much more self-reflective. And I think De La is similar. And I think, I'm grateful. I am grateful to have been born in the early 80s and to come into a love for hip hop in the early 90s. And to still have at least a core group of those folks I loved still doing it and still making things. Like, that to me is, and to have those things that they're making sometimes feel very fresh. Hip hop is still such a young genre, and when I look at almost all the other genres I love deeply, be it like hardcore, punk, funk music, jazz, all these genres I love, you get folks who are just kind of doing legacy tours, which I also understand. Like I'm not above going to see an artist that I love play through all the shit that I could not see when I was young. But it is dope to love hip hop and say, well, this is still a very young genre. And so the practitioners of it have a lot of time ahead of them to invent what they want a late career of rapping to look like. That's kind of being invented in real time. We're inventing that plane as it's being flown. And it's not all like people pining for another Jay-Z record, it is sometimes like someone like Slick Rick or like someone like De La, still kind of reinventing what their things could sound like.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I was thinking about and thinking through as I was reading the book, because I know you all remember a period, and I think it was largely kind of driven by hip hop journalists to some degree, right? This notion, um, I mean, and maybe listeners, I don't know, but this idea of hip hop as a young man's or young person's genre, right? And there was this period at which there was a real kind of question that I remember being posed kind of over and over of, can people after a certain age still make a great hip hop record, right? And then there kind of became a thing of like, terms like grown man rap or whatever. And this idea of like, people like our age, right? Us liking a certain kind of nostalgic or, return, as you were saying, Hanif, a little bit of people kind of going back. And I think as artists, like you did, I think you're right. There is the impulse probably to return. But I think even more than that, it's probably the pressure, because I think a lot of these folks actually don't want to go backwards and to say, hey, we're going to redo, a 3 Feet High. I mean, it's quite clear from De La Soul that often, I mean, 3 Feet High specifically, perhaps we could talk about a little bit related to this, that I think they liked it at the time, but they didn't like how it was promoted. And you talk about this, Austin, too. And they have this kind of also antagonistic feeling towards their own singles, because they're often songs that they're doing to fulfill something that their record label is sort of demanding from them, but not necessarily something that they want to do. And in some cases, they definitely don't. And then some of those songs become some of their biggest hits. And I love De La Soul singles, right? So I have this conflicted relationship with them of sort of like, okay, I know why you might sort of hate me, myself, and I, but also this is like one of my favorite songs that you ever did. Or, pick another single of theirs, right, where they might feel similarly. And so there's this thing with them where this was kind of what I was getting at a little bit earlier, that I have always felt like they did want to do something different, and they wanted to do something different because they had matured, or there was something else going on in rap music at the time, or within maybe Black culture at the time, that they wanted to intervene on in a specific way. And, they weren't, and then sometimes that involved, I mean, De La Soul is Dead is kind of the classic version of this, right? Because they're really literally have the crushed flower pot on, the front of the album. And they're really saying like that era of our music is done, and we're like actively disassociating ourselves from it. And yet at the same time, there's so much continuity also, I think, between kind of who they are creatively, that it's not as though doing something different for them always means doing something dramatically different, right? It's just kind of a shift in tone, a shift in emphasis, maybe different objects of critique from one album to the next, maybe a little bit of self-critique or self-reference around, ways that they've changed. And it's so I guess what I'm saying is, for me, that category, or that idea of sort of a grown man rap or whatever you would call it, they have always kind of been, I guess, on the cutting edge of doing that to some extent, but also kind of disproving that that's a thing at the same time, I guess, is sort of the way I think about it. Um, I don't know if you all have thoughts on that specific thing.
I think, when we think about 3 Feet High and Rising, and I mean, it's like a classic case of, artists, trying to be as creative as possible. And sort of, you can tell that, obviously alongside with Prince Paul, there's a lot of creative discovery that's going on. And, it's a moment when, this creativity, this burst of creativity sort of collides with, the quote unquote market or the industry, right? And the sort of realities of, okay, for this record label to sort of be able to function, we need to bring in revenue. And the way that we bring in revenue is through, we need a hit, right? We need a hit. And so, no, like all of it, the packaging, like you said, the marketing, it all is almost too successful for the group, because then the group is, when they are promoting De La Soul is Dead. I mean, at one point, Maceo was like, yeah, we had to kill the Daisy because it was going to kill us. Right. Because they felt like, the marketing and the Dayglow imagery and sort of the, the implications of what it meant to be a hippie. Right. Especially as that sort of, really clashed with, our, understandings of what Black masculinity or straight Black masculinity is. It seemed like all those things were sort of going to start impinging on them to the point to where, yeah, like they had to fight their way out of it, literally, in some cases. Right. So I think on the one hand you have that, but then on the other hand, yeah, it was, well, how do we survive as artists? Right. And we survive as artists if we change, because things change over time. And they begin to they set this blueprint that I think Nas follows, right? I mean, because it's something that Nas, remarks about, especially after Illmatic. It's, folks want me to do another Illmatic. I can't go back and do that, right? Outkast, like, their, all their albums are pretty different, very different. And you can tell that they're growing with each album. And I think De La Soul, in many ways, pioneered this in a way that, other artists that came out in the 1980s and early 1990s couldn't do. And so, yeah, that's why every single album, at least up until Mosaic Thump, is sort of a departure album, right? It's just different. And then they sort of, Mosaic Thump is a departure album, but it's also a reset, right? They decide that, okay, we're going to try to go back to basics here and sort of also incorporate more, collaboration. So no, I think you're right in terms of this idea there being, this idea of rap being a quote unquote young man's game, and then sort of figuring out, well, how do we survive all this? Because we are also working artists, and the way that we do it is we actually just accept that we change over time.
Yeah, Austin, I loved how you wrote about, I think it was chapter 5 in the book, De La Soul's Dead chapter. We did talk about their complexities around masculinity, the presentation of straight Black masculinity. That was a real, that's something I don't think I'd even considered in thinking about this arc of their lives and careers, what it meant to be, I don't know, surrounded by flowers and the hippie culture and all these things, in their kind of rebellion against that being tied to some real ideas, some kind of binary ideas around what Black masculinity was. I thought that was a really wonderful excursion within the book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's talk about Stakes is High, because I think it's an album for all of us that is, one of their most important albums. It's also the album where they, where where Prince Paul makes his departure from the group, right? Amicably to some extent, although, you can tell in interviews from Paul that there's like a little bit of a like, yeah, I said, hey, if you want to do it your way, like go ahead and do it. But then he was sort of maybe hoping that they would say, no, we want you. And so, but he goes on and does a lot of stuff I love too, as as a solo artist and as an artist that collaborates with a lot of folks. But they wanted to make a different type of record and have a different type of vibe. And again, this is very tied into where we kind of started with 1996 and what's going on in the industry. And I think also them fighting to maintain a relevance of their voice in a shifting terrain. And it also is really an important album for, and you talk about this in the book as well, Austin, for the generation of what we in our era called underground hip hop, right? Or just the proliferation of artists kind of working on independent labels, you know, things like Operation Doomsday and MF Doom and, you know, Raucous Records and all of this sort of stuff that really comes after. Say a little bit about the importance of this album for each of you.
Yeah, like I said earlier, you know, it's a album that, yeah, it's the first De La Soul album, you know, that I bought in real time. And I think, you know, at this time, like I was still, you know, very much a Wu-Tang fan, right? I mean, like, so I'm still sort of like counting down, you know, until they, you know, release their, you know, follow up to Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers. But also, I do think I was looking for something else, right? I don't think I entirely knew it at the time. But yeah, like, you know, I still like Tupac, but, you know, uh, some of his music was like sort of getting a little grating, and I was sort of feeling more distant from it, you know, compared to like Me Against the World. You know, like I loved It Was Written, you know, and I loved Reasonable Doubt, but you know, I love those albums, but didn't really feel like I related to them as much as I did, you know, Low End Theory or Midnight Marauders. You know, so Stakes is High comes out and it's just like, oh wow, like they are, you know, talking about serious issues within hip hop, especially the materialism, you know, and gangster rap and sort of, you know, commercial rap. And, you know, so these were some of the things that I was beginning to, you know, rebel against or turn away from, you know, in the, in 97, 98, 99, and 2000. So yeah, for me, you know, just like it was a turning point album, you know, just as a hip hop fan, and then beginning to sort of think more about, you know, myself as someone who is, you know, about to graduate from high school and become an adult and what that meant. And I think it's interesting that after Stakes is High, that's when I bought Balloon Mind State. Right. I mean, like, that's when, you know, I noticed it at the Circuit City, you know, and I kept on looking at it and I'm like, no, let's buy this. And, you know, I think that sort of, you know, Stakes is High became this sort of initial portal for me to listen to the rest of De La Soul's discography fully, but then also, yeah, like Mos Def, right? And then obviously Black Star, Gang Star's Moment of Truth, Company Flow, right? I mean, all these artists that, you know, begin to sort of flow out of, you know, the Stakes is High moment.
Yeah, you know, my most of my family's from New York. Or grew up in the Jersey area, and so when I was in, my grandparents were all in the projects in New York and Queens and Brooklyn, and so growing up, we would take these road trips back to New York, and a New York that is, of course, very different than the New York of now, right? It was grittier and grimier in these places, and so I mentioned that to say, you know, another reason 1996 is important for me. A couple of years ago, I worked on this. I wrote and hosted and co-produced this audio documentary about the making of the score. And in order to make it, I talked to some folks. I talked to Havoc, and I talked to some other rappers who were working around that time. And it was interesting to me, although I suppose not, right? There's an ecosystem that everyone's creating in, but because Hell on Earth sounds so different from the score. But Havoc was like, all of us were listening to everything and we were responding to everything. And so there's this kind of connected world of New York rap, New York, New Jersey rap, to, you know, give Fugees a proper credit. There's this interconnected ecosystem of narrative world building around New York, New Jersey rap that is also happening in 1996. Whereas that Fugees record, the score, is talking about a very distinct immigrant experience, right? The Haitian immigrant experience, and wrapped up in this kind of concept album about, heist and all this stuff. And Hell on Earth is, to me, one of the greatest albums of all time, but like ultimately terrifying, deeply terrifying record. Not just the sonic world that Havoc builds, but the matter. I mean, Prodigy's greatest strength. I tend to think Prodigy's one of those people who was actually a better orator than he was a rapper. I mean, Prodigy's greatest strength was just the ability to vividly depict and articulate extreme violence with a level of calm that is just absolutely chilling, right? Like the very last verse on the title track of Hell on Earth is just terrifying, right? But it was so, it moved me deeply, right? Because I grew up around people who were not that far from that. And then you have folks like Tribe and like De La who were building this kind of alternative. I don't like the word alternative because it positions them almost as in opposition to all these other folks. And I think the point Havoc was making was that like there was no opposition, but it was creating a universe wherein these issues that they were living in and living alongside were very important. And they wanted to articulate them, but they also kind of just wanted to hang out. Like Stakes is High just has like songs like Dinnernet where it's like, where the ladies at? Where the fellas at? We're just chilling, And so there are, and I think the title of the album too is telling and interesting and enjoyable for me to think on, because they were discussing a landscape for them where the stakes were very high, but maybe not exactly as high as they were for someone like Havoc and Prodigy and Queens at the moment. But their stakes were high from a career standpoint, but also from a survival standpoint and from a sustaining a narrative arc that allows them ownership over their own abilities and their own desires. And so I tend to think about Stakes is High, which is a record I love deeply, in this lineage of New York and New Jersey rap that was coming out in 1996 that felt like it was building narratives from not only every borough, but every corner of every borough. And when I tie those records together, it that Black Moon record, Digging in the Vaults, came out. Like, I think there's stuff, that Shaheem record, which I love in part, as I mentioned earlier, which I love in part because it's like a youthful perspective of what it is to survive. I think, J. Rue had that album come out that year. All these things. What I'm saying is like there's an ecosystem that I tie into geographically that I really love.
That is, very important in terms of, De La Soul trying to carve out their own sort of space within, hip hop is sort of turning darker. I mean, and it sort of turns darker in a sort of real way. And that's something that De La Soul captures on Stakes is High, whether it is through the skits, right? Just the sort of conversations that are happening, whether it's about OJ or there's the sort of one conversation, like there's the one sort of, person that is, saying some incredibly racist stuff, right? Like, they capture that moment. They also capture, the houseless person who is sort of, talking about how, they're going, like how he has to try to survive on the streets. And that sort of leads directly into Stakes is High. And yeah, Stakes is High, like the stakes were high for De La Soul. And they were high for the industry. I mean, it's like when Dave says, I got questions if you're ready to die. I mean, he's directly addressing Biggie and Tupac, right? And sort of when where hip hop is going in the sort of thesis that if you invest more in trying to accumulate wealth and material and sort of be in conspicuous consumption, it makes you a target, right? It can make you a target for violence. And what happens 3 months later? Tupac is murdered, right? And then what happens several months later? Biggie is murdered, right? I mean, so in some ways, while, I think critics, some critics unfairly sort of question that album, it was incredibly prescient in a way that, the score also had that critique, the sort of critique of gangster rap in it. But I mean, there is something prophetic about Stakes is High as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's one of the things that connected with me about it at the time too, was like a kind of, it's a reality check, I think, of an album, about like where things are within the industry and sort of different ways that this could go, right? But one of the interesting things to me to think about has always been the role of Long Island specifically within hip hop history. and the way that we get all of these really, really amazing and interesting artists from Long Island, and its own kind of ecosystem, and how, you know, Long Island's a very interesting place, and it's also not homogenous or monolithic. Like, there are different pockets that, each county has a different flavor to it out there, as do different, small cities or suburbs within the county. Um, but, you get EPMD, you get Public Enemy, you get Rakim, you get, De La Soul, you do get, KMD, MF Doom. You get like so many of these artists that are literally my favorite, right? Or among my very favorite folks. And it obviously also has the access to New York City, the proximity to New York City. It is in its own way kind of, a sixth borough or whatever, right? But it is also different and a kind of unique place. And I also think in some ways both of you being from Ohio is interesting, because Ohio it has some of those elements as well in different parts of having big cities and being kind of close to New York, but also, in its own world to some extent. And I always kind of wonder about what is it that draws me to Long Island rap, or what is it about Long Island rappers specifically? And you know, we don't need to answer a question that big, but like, there are certainly ways I think that influences De La Soul's music, and I think that presents a different experience for a lot of folks, maybe, or they're coming from a different point of view than people who are growing up, in Queensbridge projects or Marcy or something like that.
Yeah, Long Island, I think there should be some kind of documentary or narrative building around, because you'd also get interesting groups like Son of Berserk and rappers like Freddie Fox and Granddaddy IU. I mean, it's just like everyone sounded a little bit different, not just different from what was going on, but different from each other, and that to me is deeply impressive. And I also think I think people do not have good memory and thought processes around how that can happen. But to be from Ohio, for example, which is the birthplace of funk, though it oftentimes does not get credited as such, you get in these little square blocks of Dayton, you would get like 5 different bands coming out of the same neighborhood, and they would all sound different, not entirely in opposition to each other sonically, but because you're in that proximity and you're hearing what everyone else is doing, that gives you an opportunity to say, here's how I can do this a little bit differently. Here's how I can become a little bit more strange, or a little bit more unique. Here's how I can perhaps take some of the stylistic emceeing abilities of, say, a Rakim, and then tweak it a bit, that to me, I'm so invested in hyper regional sound, because oftentimes we hear people talk about New York rap as though it is just one big blob, one amorphous blob of a thing. And I saw a list recently online when I was doing some research for something, and it was like the 50 best New York rap albums. And I was like, man, that doesn't actually do a service to, you break this up by borough, you can break it up by block in some cases, because you don't in that kind of construct, in that kind of convention, listening convention, you don't honor a group like Sons of Berserk, which was such a weird group of dudes who came out of Long Island and made, I don't know if they only made one record. I think they maybe only made one record. That is so strange, but also influential. And that gets lost when you just lump it all together. So I think De La and a lot of those Long Island folks, like the big name ones there, being like him, Public Enemy, EPMD, these folks made their mark, but also they were able to make their mark because of this kind of unspoken ecosystem they existed in, where they were hearing people very up close and saying, I would like to build upon what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing else to add to sort of, y'all's observations about Long Island, because I think y'all, just hit it on the head. But talking about growing up in Ohio and sort of encountering hip hop, I mean, I think, this might be where the sort of cliches about the Midwest being a sort of cross section, of the United States sort of come into play, at least in my experience, where, yeah, it's like I started listening to hip hop and it was West Coast. And then, at some point, my focus shifts to the East Coast, even though I'm still sort of listening to, I was still listening to like West Side Connection and some of these groups. But then when, Common and Bone Thugs and Harmony dropped, it was like, oh, like there is hip hop that is sort of in closer proximity, to where I live and where we live and sort of how we are sort of engaging. And I think that, also appealed, to us. I mean, so like, yeah, there was this, you could all like, I feel like living in Mansfield, right, in the mid 1990s, like you were going to find debates around like who was better between Wu-Tang or No Limit, or everyone is listening to Southern Playalistic or Crucial Conflict, or, you could have, like a lot of people probably did have serious debates about Tupac and Biggie and sort of, but while you're sort of having these debates, you're still sort of like, I like both, right? Like, like both sounds sort of appeal to me. And then of course, right, we get Dilla and Some Village, and eventually like Eminem and stuff. So it's like, yeah, I feel like my experience has been sort of the argument that, the middle of the, like Ohio representing some part of the middle of the quote unquote country, we are sort of exposed to a lot more. We might be in at least some of my friends at certain points might have been a lot more open-minded to our tastes than maybe if we had sort of grown up, in New York City or in Los Angeles or in Houston.
It's so funny. I had a roommate when I lived in New York who used to say to me, if he said, most people who listen to rap, they have a favorite team. He said, you're somebody who likes the whole sport. And it was just the eclecticness of my rap collection when I moved in. He was a roommate and we shared a space, and he'd just be like, you've got, Too Short and, a bunch of underground stuff. And then you got DMX, and then, you have De La. And it was just, to me, that was always the thing, was like, it was all a process of discovery and, trying to find out what's going on hyper locally in these different places around the country. And him, as somebody who grew up in the Bronx his whole life, like he really couldn't relate to that. He was like, like he was the person who you would come home and DMX would be blasting, and that was, that was his, he had other things too. He was a backup dancer for Ziggy back in the day. So anyway, there was, a complicated relationship to all of it. But yeah.
This was a delight. Austin, the book is really special. And I think too, one thing that I was mentioning earlier was about hip hop being a young genre and the practitioners of it figuring out how to build a legacy as it's happening. And I think writers are also practitioners. I mean, I think, if we think about the elements and the things that make up hip hop as a whole beyond the music, knowledge is one of them. In building a framework where there's we're not only building knowledge for ourselves, but making it accessible for others. I think that's just such a foundational part of what hip hop is in building the legacy as it's happening. And that's what it is. And so thank you for your contribution to that. It's a really special book.
Yeah, no, I totally appreciate it. And of course, yeah, I just can't let you go without mentioning, how formative Go Ahead in the Rain, was in sort of my thinking, whether it was, sort of planning my classes and sort of introducing students to A Tribe Called Quest and Native Tongues, but then also just even thinking about this book, thinking about living in a daisy age and how I was going to approach that. And, as we were sort of saying, right, it's sort of like, you're saying growing up on the same block, and it's like, well, how am I going to do this a little differently,
Right. Yeah.
Because of course, like, not going to be able to sort of, live up to that, so no, I totally appreciate it.
No doubt. Appreciate y'all both, and we'll talk soon, hopefully.
Yeah, sounds good.
Appreciate you too, Hanif. I just have to say before I let you go that one of our teams will not go 82-0 after
because they're playing tonight.
Yeah.
So anyways, good luck, and I will love you however it comes out.
doubt.
But I always appreciate you.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Peace, y'all.
All right.
Yeah, take
All
care.
right, peace.